Welcome, good evening, wherever you're calling us from. I'm Dr. Mike Lenore, and this is the Wellness Watch. And we're missing a key element of the Wellness Watch. Mr. Ellis Dean will not be joining us today, so we're going to have to kind of wing it today, and we hope that you'll help us by joining to ask questions and get engaged and get involved and let us know where you're calling from. The Wellness Watch is sponsored by the African American Wellness Project. It's also sponsored by blackdoctors.org. And so if you want to join us, you've got a question, this is your program, this is your time. You can answer, we'll answer whatever we can, and we'll answer anything that comments that you want to make. Our special guest today will be Dr. Joe Cram. He is going to be talking about sleep, something that we all kind of struggle with from time to time. And he's going to talk about how significant the problem is. He's going to give us some ideas about what sleep specialists do and how you might holistically deal with a sleep problem, and maybe those with a more difficult problem, we may be considered talking about other forms of therapy. So before we do that, like I say, welcome again to the Welcome Watch. I want to start off first with a couple of news items. Obviously, you're probably COVIDed to death, but a couple of significant things happened this week in the COVID front. First of all, it's clear that we need a booster. I'm not surprised. As a pediatrician, you may not be either. You know, generally, when we get an immune response, sometimes that response needs a little jerk, and that's what the booster will be. I think everybody should really start to think about when they're eligible to get it and get that booster. We're certainly still dealing with hesitancy on the part of a number of people in our country, probably a third of the country, still not vaccinated. Hopefully, because the FDA approved the safety of the Pfizer vaccine, that it says that 3 out of 10 people who are hesitant were waiting for that. Hopefully, we'll see that happens, and hopefully we'll get a situation where we have a lot of opportunities to get these shots. You have to realize now that I think we're all in this together. As long as you're not vaccinated, it puts you at risk to yourself, to your family, to your children, especially since now they're going to school. With FDA approval, that's one more notch in the belt of the effectiveness of these vaccines. And we hope that you take the time to deal with that. So that's one issue. The other issue that came up this week is that diabetes. We used to start to think that we need to screen for diabetes at age 40 and above for both diabetes and what we call prediabetes. Prediabetes is when your blood sugar is a little bit above normal, but you're not actually in the diabetic stage yet. Remember some numbers. Your blood sugar should be less than 100. Your hemoglobin A1C really should be less than 6, but certainly less than 7. Well, now the American Diabetic Association has said that, we can't wait until you're 40. We got to start at 35. They've noticed that at 35 is when they start to see a fair number of people blood sugar go up, and even people slip into diabetes. Another study which should interest you as parents is that if you look at the number of children who are developing type 1 and type 2 diabetes, a study this month showed and suggested that with these children, we're starting to see more type 1 and type 2 diabetes. It goes along with more obesity. I think that the coronavirus epidemic, COVID-19, may mean 19 pounds to you or your children. And so consequently, you have to start to watch their weight, because diabetes can lead to heart attacks and strokes in adults. And so now we're screening at 35. We're not just screening at 40. And finally, I saw an article that said that, somebody's taken foods and have determined if you eat a certain food, how much time that adds or subtracts to your life. One hot dog subtracts 36 minutes from your life. Vegetables add 43 minutes. I mean, they've got all these foods laid out now, and this was from the Council on Nutrition. They have actually added together the number of minutes you get for the foods you eat or the number of minutes you've lost. Well, they're going to be very unhappy with my dinner tonight, so I probably lost maybe an hour with what I plan to eat, but I'll be a little bit more cautious. from the beginning. One hot dog, 34 minutes. One regular soda, something like 24 minutes. Vegetables add 43 minutes. And so consequently, we only keep up with that particular index. Man, I'm going to have to change. I may make a call home and change the diet. So now we're going to talk to our special guest, Dr. Joe Cram. Dr. Cram has been a friend of mine for as long as I can remember friends. He is a sleep specialist. He did his training at New York University, where he graduated with honors, and also did his internal medicine and sleep training at the University of California, San Francisco. He is an expert in sleep, and not only does he treat patients, but he instructs other people across the country on the importance of sleep and ways and techniques to get it. So, Dr. Cram, I want to welcome you to the Welcome Watch. And remember, those of you who have questions, put them in the chat room, where this program is really designed to answer your questions. So, Dr. Cram, welcome to the program again. The sleep is a big issue for many of us. First of all, why do we really need sleep?
Well, my smart aleck response has always been, we need sleep so we don't feel sleepy. And
that's the kind of answer that we're not really satisfied with.
Because if we don't get sleep, it really tremendously impacts our performance across the board, physically and mentally. And, that's clearly been shown over and over again to be an issue. And what also has been shown to be an issue is that people don't recognize it and they're in denial about it. So, for example, this population, our culture, promotes the fact that you can get away with 6 hours of sleep a night and do fine. And knowing you, Mike, you're probably going to tell me that you only sleep 4.5 hours and think it's just fine. But in fact, when measured objectively, performance, as I said, both mentally and physically, are clearly impacted when you begin to get even 6 hours a night of sleep compared to what we consider the normal range, which in adults is somewhere between 7 and 9 hours a night.
Yeah, I can't remember the last time I've gotten 7 or 8 hours worth of sleep. What am I losing? What am I missing because I don't get that sleep?
Well, as I say, there is some range, so not everybody's affected the same. But what you're missing is slowing down of reflexes and memory and creativity is actually impacted. And we'll talk about that as we go forward and talk a little bit about the different stages of sleep. But, each stage of sleep has some kind of relevant function, because sleep is not just an on-off switch. It's actually a pretty complex behavior. And it impacts all, depending on which part of your sleep is impacted, has different effects on people.
Now, this is kind of an off-the-wall question. Are human sleep patterns, are they similar to sleep patterns of other mammals, other animals, or how do we differ?
Well, we don't differ all that much from other mammals, except some of them have it flipped around, because we know animals have nocturnal patterns. So they at night are flipped from ours, but they still have, the important thing is all living creatures have what's called a circadian rhythm. Circadian is from the Latin words circa, which means about, dia or day. So it's about one day. So our internal clock regulates sleep and wake in a rhythmic pattern when our sleep is normal. And it actually turns out a Nobel Prize was awarded to a couple of sleep scientists maybe 5 years ago now, 4 years ago, for helping to identify the fact that the genes in our body, there's a gene called the clock gene, and it regulates our sleep-wake cycle. And all of our body has it. And this is our 24-hour cycle, where we get, if it works, 16 hours of wakeful time and 8 hours of sleep time. And that in the population as a whole, that rhythm is pretty entrenched, is pretty firm. We maybe have a little bit of a delay, but the best and easiest example of what happens when circadian rhythm gets out of whack is jet lag. You know, when you land in somewhere that's 5 hours different time zone and you try and function, you're going to usually be impacted because you're out of sync with your own internal clock, trying to be on the region's clock. So that's very closely regulated and very important. So if we don't give ourselves the opportunity to get that sleep, then we've got a problem.
I notice that we always talk about various stages of sleep. What are the stages of sleep, and what elements are important in those stages?
So there are 4 stages of sleep. Well, first of all, let's count wake as a stage. So we're awake for a large portion of the day. When we first fall into sleep, we go through light sleep, which is called stage 1, and it's just a brief period of transition. The majority of the night, 45% or so, is spent in stage 2 sleep, which is normal amount of the biggest part of our night is in stage 2 sleep. But then we get in the next stage after that is stage 3 sleep, which is deep sleep and also called slow wave sleep, because our brain dramatically slows down in its function. And what we think is going on in slow wave sleep, and it's called delta wave sleep, it's called as mostly just deep sleep, is that our information that we've absorbed in the course of the day is reorganized and put into long-term storage in the back of our brain. Okay? And then the last stage of sleep is one that most people have heard about. It's called Rem sleep, which stands for rapid eye movement. And it's in rapid eye movement that the great majority of all of our dreaming goes on. And what we believe is going on in Rem sleep is that all the information we take in the course of a day has to be filtered. If our brain retained every single event and every thought that we had, our brains would be overwhelmed. So we have to have some way of sorting it out and sort of discarding what we don't need and retaining what we do need. And that goes on a lot in Rem sleep, that organization. And then the brain moves that REM memory and that information from the front of the brain where REM sleep's going on to the back of the brain, where, as I said, is where the long-term storage units are. So REM sleep is crucial for sorting out and absorbing new information. It's also crucial for memory, and it's crucial for creativity, because that's when our brains are linking different things together. So it takes an idea from here, and an idea from here, an idea from here, and puts them together in a way that becomes a coherent thought and a coherent process. So those are the stages. 1, light sleep. 2, normal sleep. Stage 3 is slow wave. 4 is REM.
All right, what is the definition of insomnia?
Insomnia these days is defined as difficulty falling asleep, difficulty staying asleep, or difficulty maintaining good quality restful sleep.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about those 3 phases. First of all, what percentage of people who have insomnia have trouble going to sleep? And well, each stage separately. You can tell us exactly what percentage or what group, how large the group is that has trouble going to sleep, and what can you do differently to get to sleep?
Well, let me just interject for a moment here that there's a couple of books I want to recommend to people. And one is called Why We Sleep, but there's a new one out from a colleague of mine, a friend of mine at Stanford, called How to Sleep. It's by Rafael Pelayo. And And because there are tricks to learning how to sleep and how to wind down and decompress a little bit. So falling asleep is very common. Difficulty falling asleep is very common, is the commonest type of insomnia. But the next most common would be waking up too early, maintaining sleep through the night. And I would say that about a third of the adult population have a significant issue with insomnia at some points in their life. Almost everybody has an occasional night where they can't sleep, but persistent problem sleeping probably occur in a third of people. And that's a lot of people. And what happens, there's different reasons. People will say, I can't shut my brain down. I can't quiet things down. I can't slow down. And there are tricks to this. So today, what we have found in treating insomnia is that helping people to change their behaviors, to change their habits, to have what we call good sleep hygiene, good sleep rules, is very helpful. And we teach that through a technique called cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. And we call it CBT-I for insomnia. And CBT is a matter of self-awareness and understanding sleep's normal rhythm and trying to do what we can to stick to that rhythm. Because it's when people get into wildly aberrant changing patterns that tends to reinforce problems with sleep. Now, our culture is heavily balanced or heavily represented with shift workers. They have a dreadful time because they're imposing problems with this rhythm of sleep on themselves because of their careers and lives. But if you don't have shift work, you can still have very bad habits of bedtime habits and wake up habits. Bedtime, we really try and encourage people to have a relatively repetitive bedtime.
That
And
means, what does that mean to you?
well, it's changing as I get older. Classically, we get to bed as adolescents and teenagers. We tend to want to stay up later and later, and our clocks internally are wired to stay up later. As we've gotten older, and as we all get older, we tend to go to bed earlier and earlier. So it depends a little bit on where in your life cycle we're talking about. For me right now, I'm getting to bed closer to 10 p.m. Than I ever did before. That would have been obscenely early for me 10 years ago, probably. But now I more routinely go to bed. Some of that's driven by the fact that your favorite patient, my wife, goes to bed around 9 or 9:30. So it's hard to stay up by myself. But
what do you have to do? I mean, some people talk about the fact that they go to sleep with the TV on, or they go to sleep with a book or something. What is the ideal? Obviously, everybody's different patterns, but what are the practical things that people can do who are not who have trouble going to sleep?
So, perfect question. Good segue. You've done this before, haven't you?
I
So, the first things we have to do are start to shut down our brains about an hour or so before bedtime. We want to have everything begin to slow down. And by that, I mean we're not doing things that are super stimulating. We want to be able to avoid the screens that we're all exposed to now. So we know that the blue light in a cell phone, in a laptop, in a tablet goes into our eyeballs. And light is one of the main things that sets our internal clock. And if we have that blue light shining in our brains, into our eyes, going to our brain, it's going to tend to promote us staying awake longer. So avoiding the screen exposure in the last hour or so before we go to bed. What happens in the last hours before bed is that our brain wants to start shutting down. What it does is it starts producing a hormone called melatonin. Most people have heard of melatonin. Many of them think of it as a sleeping pill, but it's really not a very good sleeping pill. What it does is begin to shut the brain's alertness down and get us ready to help fall asleep. It's actually one time when I do use a medication and not just behavior, because sometimes I will have people take a very, very low dose of melatonin, 1 to 3 milligrams max. But the key is taking it a couple of hours before bedtime to help the brain begin to slow down and begin to shut off our alertness. So we want to do that either with melatonin, but hopefully just naturally let things slow down a little bit and not do something that's too stimulating.
So that kind of means no sex before you go to sleep.
Well, that depends if it's still stimulating or not. So, but it is a trade-off. Let's just say.
Right.
So
you say so then that hour before you go to sleep, you just got to calm down a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
What about the physical structures around you?
We used to think exercising, physical exercise, right before bedtime was very disruptive of sleep. Well, it turns out that's not necessarily true, and it varies from person to person. In general, we don't think it interferes with sleep that much, but some people it does. So you have to gauge yourself. Some people it helps them go to sleep. So that's something we've revisited in the last years.
Should the room be dark? Should you be?
It should be dim light. Melatonin is produced in darkness. So what this little onset of melatonin production I mentioned is called DLMO, dim light melatonin onset. And DLMO begins 1 to 2 hours before bedtime, and it occurs when the lighting around us is dim. So one of the more powerful tools we can do to help ourselves fall asleep is to avoid bright light and, in fact, dim lights in the hour or two before sleep, and see if we can't function. It doesn't have to be dark, so dark you can't do something. It just has to be dimmer. I started to say one tool that helps us is the dimmers, because the dimmer on your room light, if you cut it down about halfway, it's going to cut back on the blue light, but not so much on the lower frequency orange red light, which promotes sleep. So a dimmer in your room or in your lamp is a pretty good tool.
So I've got a question here. You mentioned that CBT learning. Let me put that up here.
CBTI.
Yeah, CBTI and learning techniques to sleep and slow your mind. Is this a technique that needs physician overview or something we can educate ourselves on through various books and holistic methods?
I believe that you can start by doing it yourself. There's a couple of free programs and there's a couple of commercial programs. Most CBTI programs are about 6 weeks, with about an hour invested a week in learning about sleep and good behaviors. There's one called CBTI-Coach, and it's on your phone. It's free. It was built by Stanford and by the VA to help soldiers coming back with PTSD, with post-traumatic stress disorder. And so CBT-I-Coach is a free program I send a lot of patients to. If you want a little slicker program, there's a couple of them available. One's called Sleep.io, and it's got a cute little Scottish guy who coaches you into better sleep habits. And then there's one that has been called Shut Eye, SHUT letter I. And it's come back with a different name, but it's one I liked a lot. These are, as I say, you have to purchase these. They're just a little better done, a little easier, a little more user-friendly. So there are programs out there that you can use yourself. Now, there are behavioral psychologists who coach good sleep habits and teach CBT in person. And that's definitely an option, especially if you're having trouble despite maybe trying to do it on your own. There also are some books that take these courses and summarize the CBTI in a bunch of chapters that are broken up to mimic the in-person experience.
I got another question here
Yeah.
from Lauren Reed. Her boyfriend sleeps 3 hours a night. What can she do to help him?
You might want to find another boyfriend, but no, first of all, very few people really only sleep 3 hours. It's exceedingly rare to be that short a sleeper. A lot of people are getting a little more sleep than they realize. So there's something called sleep misperception that's actually surprisingly common, where you're in bed and you think you're awake, but it's interspersed with periods of sleep. But you remember being awake. Why? Because you're awake. And so you remember being awake. You don't remember being asleep because you're asleep.
Right.
And so the actual number of people who are such short sleepers is very rare. So some of it is about structuring it. The other thing then depends on when he's getting that sleep, that your boyfriend, that boyfriend of this caller and or writer. And so what I do to help people get back on a good rhythm is to key in on their wake up time. So we start with a desired wake up time. And let's say this 3 hour sleeper wants to get up for work at 6 a.m. All right. What I tell them is, okay, you're only sleeping 3 hours. You can't go to bed until 3 a.m. Then you'll get your 3 hours, and I want you to wake up at 6 a.m. no matter what. They look at you like you're out of your mind because they say, I can't stay up until 3 in the morning. Are you kidding? That's impossible. And I say, well, wait a minute. You just finished telling me you're only getting 3 hours. I'm just asking you to shift the time. Okay, so they go to bed, and I actually don't usually do 3 hours. That's a little too extreme. So I might say, if you want to wake up at 6, go to bed at 1 a.m. And what happens often, most of the time, is they begin to sleep from 1 a.m. to 6 a.m. I then add back 15 or 20 minutes on the front end. So now, or maybe a half hour. So now instead of 1, they go to bed at 12:30, but still aim for a 6 a.m. wake up. And you can see where I'm going with this. We rebuild a sleep pattern that allows them to be getting more hours of sleep in a consolidated block.
Now, I have a different problem. I'll go to sleep, and an hour and a half, I'll wake up, then I'll stay awake for 2 or 3 hours, and then I'll go back to sleep. I don't prefer to do that. I used to not mind that, but I don't prefer to do that. What's my problem?
Well, the approach I just told you actually can work for that. You've got to force yourself to stay up and not go to bed that hour and a half, 2 hours early. See if you can go to bed later and sleep through until a more desirable wake up time. And I know another person who has that kind of pattern, wakes up in the middle of the night and she reads her newspapers and this and that, and then goes back to sleep. And at least when her allergies aren't bothering her. And so.
But let me ask you another question. Our time has to be a little bit more efficient in getting the knowledge we need from you. when does somebody need to see you then? If the things are simple enough to get an app and to change the pattern, what kind of persons do you see? And when is the problem more serious?
Well, so it depends, of course, on which sleep issue we're talking about. If we stick with insomnia for a minute, and somebody's tried, quote, everything, read the book and tried some of these tricks and knows about what I just described, which is called sleep restriction, and they just aren't getting anywhere. I or somebody with the same kind of background can be the coach in person, and sometimes that's more powerful to getting people to really follow the suggestions and follow the rhythm by having somebody to answer to and checking up on you is a pretty powerful tool. And you certainly understand the power of just a physician presence and input. So it is powerful in some people. But we're ignoring a whole area, of course, of other sleep issues that aren't insomnia, that lead to excessive sleepiness, especially during the day. And the one that I deal with by far the most is called obstructive sleep apnea. And apnea is a condition that occurs when the muscles in the throat don't work and allow the throat to close up, blocking the airway, so that somebody's now struggling to breathe until finally they gasp and open their throat and start breathing again, whereupon they fall asleep immediately. And that awakening and taking some breaths is such a short period, maybe seconds, that they don't know they were awake. But they may have repetitive episodes of waking over and over again through the night. And in the morning, they're not fully refreshed. And in the course of the next day, they're tired and have trouble with concentration, mood, memory, focus, because they're actually sleep deprived, even though they don't know it.
So but those are the people that just wouldn't respond to just behavior change. They have to have some major interventions. What are what are some of the things that you suggest for those people? Those people with that problem.
The first order of business is to suspect sleep apnea, because sleep apnea presents differently in different people. It's surprising how much sleep apnea somebody can have with relatively little symptoms, or somebody can have mild sleep apnea and have severe symptoms. It's just individual response to the same kind of event. But the tip off is if somebody wakes up and says, "Doc, I was in bed 7 hours, 8 hours even, and I never feel refreshed. I never feel great when I wake up." That's a real tip off that something's wrong with their sleep. Because if you're sleeping 7 or 8 hours or in bed 7 or 8 hours and don't feel refreshed, more often than not, I would say 90% of the time, something is going on with your sleep. Now, sleep apnea is by far the commonest thing. So the way we approach that is to do a sleep test where we monitor breathing during sleep. And we do that very simply nowadays. We can do it in the sleep laboratory, and there are times when that's very appropriate, and we still want to do that. But there are also times when we can do it at home with some portable equipment that's reasonably reliable and easy to use. And we have people come by and pick it up, show them how to use it, or we mail it to them if they're further away, and they can usually figure out how to do it with our instruction.
Some people don't recognize, like one of the bigger problems is obviously snoring, and many people kind of feel like, snoring is kind of, a normal thing. But when they go and then they stop breathing for a while, then you need some help, and you need to at least get an evaluation.
Exactly.
Because that may mean that the implications of that have to do with the heart and the other things. And we do want to do another program on that. But I want to get to a couple of questions before we end this session. One is melatonin and its effect on adults versus effect on children, or its effect at all.
So again, melatonin is a naturally occurring hormone. It's produced in our brains in darkness. So it's called the hormone of darkness. And it's a part of the sleep-wake circadian rhythm. And everybody has it, kids and adults. One of the things that happens in Alzheimer's and in dementia is a loss of the cells that make melatonin. And so their sleep cycles get completely messed up in many cases. And because they just don't have the hormone that's crucial to this rhythmic pattern of our sleep and wake. And so now we tend not to want to give medication like that to kids, but I have used it in children when their sleep-wake cycle is really messed up. For example, there's a condition called delayed phase syndrome. And this is very prevalent in teenagers. So what happens is their internal clock is running a little bit late all the time. And in fact, they did some studies years ago, and if you isolate people from external clues, they will usually have not a 24-hour day, but a 24-and-a-quarter-hour day. So if you leave them alone every day, they would go to bed a little bit later, a little bit later, a little bit later. Well, so what happens is these teenagers, their bodies in their teens have that exaggerated. So they want to stay up late, but then if you let them sleep in, they're fine. But because they have to wake up early to go to school or perform, some work or whatever it is, they're fighting their own clock. In fact, I'm on the board of the National Sleep Foundation, and one of our main missions is to try and change the school start times. And we've begun to have some success in different places around the country, because trying to teach a teenager, something at 7 a.m. is almost a waste of time. They're just not ready to start learning because they haven't gotten enough sleep. And one of the things we've learned, and is very crucial to understand, is that if you're not well rested, you can't learn, or at least learn comparably. It's one of the ironies, because you have kids who stay up all night trying to study and cram for a final, but by the time they get to the final, they can't remember any of it or a big part of it. Because in order to retain information, your brain has to be reasonably well rested. And interestingly, if you don't get some sleep after your test or after your study time, you won't consolidate it. So it won't stay long term. So you might remember it the morning, but 3 days later or a week later, you don't remember it. There's another book I wanted to mention to you called Why We Sleep, written by Matthew Walker, who's a Cal professor. The other one was written by a Stanford professor, but they're good friends. And he talks about this need, what happens if you don't get rested before you try and learn something, and you don't get some rest after you've learned something. You're not gonna. It's going to be a lost cause to try and remember a lot of that stuff.
Well, one final question, as we have so much to talk about that we'll have to have you back for part 2. What about the things across the counter? How effective are those sleep things that say, okay, this is for sleep, this is the most wonderful thing ever? What about those? Are they mostly antihistamines that make you drowsy? What are they?
Yeah, they're pretty much 100%, 90% antihistamines, and the data shows they may promote sleepiness for a day or two, but people tend to become tolerant to their effect pretty quickly. So it begins to be just a placebo effect. Melatonin, as I say, might be an exception when used to try and help set your clock, but not as a sleeping pill.
All right. Well, we've run out of time so quickly, and there's so much left to talk about. But I want to kind of sum up with you and see if we made some salient points. First of all, sleep is a rhythm, and we need 7, 8, or 9 hours. That would be optimal. If we don't get the optimal amount of sleep, and if we get certainly less than that, we really don't retain a lot of the information, and we're not particularly comfortable. There are people who want to go to sleep too often, have too much going on when they try to go to sleep. So they need to kind of cool down, maybe an hour before, dim the lights, get the sound off, and just try to prepare themselves. That may be helpful. And you have the great technique for people who wake up in the middle of the night. Just calculate how much time you sleep, when you want to wake up, and then you go to bed at the time that will give you that same amount of sleep. And then you keep adding things to it. And there's some books and some apps that we're going to put together for part of our editing of our show that talk to people about how they can understand sleep a little better. Is there one or two final points you'd like to leave people with, Dr. Cram?
Well, again, I want to emphasize that the idea that Americans have in particular, that they can get away with 5 or 6 hours of sleep. So you got to give yourself an adequate opportunity to sleep. I think that may be one of the main things to think about. And keep in mind that sleep is crucial, not just to not feel sleepy, but is a trigger for heart disease, for diabetes. You came in with a lead on diabetes. People don't realize that if you're sleep deprived or have sleep apnea, you develop insulin resistance, which is a hallmark of the beginning of diabetes. And diabetes comes under better control with better sleep.
So I said that we were going to end the show, but this is a show for people. And there are a couple of other quick questions we might want to get to before we lose your expertise. First, the pandemic has changed sleep habits, and then people have to return to work. How long does it take to develop a new pattern?
We think that you can shift your clock about an hour a day if you need to. So if you have to shift, allow, and that, but even that hour can be a challenge. Daylight savings points that out every year, each way. People's sleep gets screwed up usually for a few days.
And what about snores? I mean, here we didn't talk about that, but for many of our listeners, there's a snorer in the family. And it's a loud, annoying snore. They don't hear it, so they don't understand how much of it. What can you do about that that doesn't involve CPAP or something for sleep apnea?
So first of all, to me, there's no such thing as normal snoring. If snoring were normal, you'd be snoring right now. So I don't believe any snoring. Now, that doesn't mean everybody's got sleep apnea. I'm not going that far. One of the other things people don't realize is how much the nose has to do with airflow. So I really focus on making sure people are treating their allergies and treating their congestion in their nose, and that if necessary, they add to that what's called a nasal dilator, something that spreads the opening of the nose, either by external, like a breathe right strip, or internal, a spring that I like people to get online called nasalaid.com. And it's amazing because people don't recognize, if you double the size of your nasal opening, you increase flow 15-fold. That's Poissal's law of flow. So it's, and if you do the experiment on yourself, everybody out there sniffs and then takes their fingers and then just gently spreads their nose, I guarantee you the majority of people are going to say, wow, that's much freer. That decreases the collapsibility of the throat and the snoring that occurs as a result. So
I've got boxes of those strips, but I didn't realize how effective they were. Well, Dr. Cram, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Obviously, there are many other things we have to talk about. Certainly, we need a whole program on sleep apnea and its impact on the heart and other organ systems. So we appreciate we appreciate you joining us, and we will have. Is it okay if people go on your website and Do you have a
Absolutely.
website?
We
And
we we our the name of our clinics are the California Center for Sleep Disorders. So we've got 4 locations around the San Francisco area at this time, down from 7 before the pandemic. But you know, we're hanging in there.
that means more sleep for you. All right. Well, thank you very much, and we look forward to talking to you again.
Thanks. Good to talk to you, Doc.
All right. So we appreciate Dr. Cram's tips on sleep. We're going to put this together so that you get some of those tips later in our program once we do a little editing and adding here and there, because there's so much there that we can't expect anyone to capture it all. I'd like to finish by talking a little bit about the upcoming programs that we plan to do. We really want to get from our audience some topics that you want to hear. Clearly, we want to establish the fact that we'll be here every week at 7 o'clock Eastern Time, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 8 o'clock Eastern Time, 5 o'clock Pacific Time, and so we want you to join us. We are going to have a special project tomorrow. We have an article on USA Today, and we're having a Twitter Space program, and we have left that information in the chat box. So thank you so much for all that Dr. Cram did. Have a great conversation on sleep. We appreciate that comment, and we'll be back to see you, to talk with you again next week, and hopefully Mr. Dean will be with us. I think you can already see that he's very much needed. So remember, help is your biggest asset. I'm Dr. Michael Norm. We'll talk again next week.